And boom, we're on. What's up, David?
Not much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, thanks for being on. I'm pretty excited to talk to you. I got your book right here.
Great.
I love the title. It explains exactly what it is.
I have my book too.
Nice. Yeah, and it's crazy. You were there. Does it feel like it was 50 years ago?
No, it's like a matter of great surprise to me that first of all, I'm still around 50 years later, and secondly, that the memories are so clear. It just seems like yesterday.
Really?
Yes.
What,
Uh,
why do you think that is? Is it because you've sort of recounted the story so often, or you have photos to kind of remember it more, or what is it just such a important event in your life that it's hard to forget?
no, it's because it was such an important event in my life. Except for getting married and my two kids, really the high point of my life was the 3 or 4 days before the launch of Apollo 11 and the time through the moon landing where I was at the Kennedy Space Center.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, just reading through your book, I was so jealous of you to be there. It sounded so incredible and awesome.
Well, I kind of grew up with the space program. I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. If I
Hmm.
would have been a little bit younger, I would have been in high school and not eligible to cover it. If I would have been a couple of years later, I probably would have been out of college by then. So
Yeah.
it was a true window of opportunity.
Yeah, so let's just get into it. How were you able as, a 19-year-old to get NASA press credentials?
Well, I was a very lucky guy. In high school, I was joined the high school newspaper, and when I got to the University of Michigan in August 1968, I decided to join the Michigan Daily. The Daily is an independent student-run newspaper that's been there since 1890, and
Wow.
it's taught generations of journalists how to be journalists because there's no journalism department as such at the University of Michigan,
Mm.
at least at that time. So I joined the Daily, and I was a little bit odd in the sense that everybody else there were political science majors, philosophy majors. I was perhaps the only person in the entire building who had any interest whatsoever in space or science. Uh, so after the first Apollo flight, Apollo 7 in October 1968, I volunteered as a freshman to write the newspaper's editorial about it. Now,
Hmm.
normally freshmen did not write editorials at all, but again, I was the only one. I was kind of the de facto space reporter.
Right.
So, so I wrote an article which stands up pretty good even today. It was called "A Case for Going to Outer Space."
Nice.
But then in December 1968, when I was back home from college in Illinois, a friend and I got together. We'd been friends for many years and both interested in space. And he suggested, why don't we go and see a Saturn V launch this summer, meaning the summer of 1969?
Uh-huh.
And we were 18 then, so at least at that time we could rent a car, we could get a motel room, we could even drink beer at that time at age 18. And so we decided to go and look at the NASA schedule, and we saw that the Apollo 11 flight was scheduled for July. And this
Yeah.
was perfect, right in the middle of our summer. So we decided to go down there one way or another, but I told them I'm going to get us press credentials. I was very kind of optimistic, perhaps overly optimistic, because when I applied to NASA, they said there were two big problems. Number one, they didn't accredit student journalists, and number two, they had over 3,500 requests for press passes.
Yeah.
And so, to make a long story short, what happened was a colleague of mine was working in Washington that summer as an editor of something called the College Press Service, which was a group of over 500 college newspapers. And he went to NASA and personally argued that I would not be covering it for the Michigan Daily. I would be covering it for this College Press Service network.
Yeah.
And with a lot of good persuasion, about a month before the launch, I had my NASA press pass in the mail.
Man, incredible. So, being that you're one of the youngest people there and you have these NASA press credentials, did you feel sort of out of place?
No, not at all. I mean, the other reporters kind of ignored us. Uh, we were kind of not even worthy of mention.
Oh my gosh.
So, but no, from the beginning of this trip, luck favored us. There's instance after instance where we really had incredible experiences with this. Just as an example, flying down on the plane, we saw this older woman who we recognized, and it turned out it was Rose Cernan, astronaut Gene Cernan's mother. So
Wow.
we rode down on the plane with her. We talked to her a little bit before. We had recognized her because we had been to a previous visit that Cernan and Stafford had made to the Chicago area.
Hmm.
We recognized her. Anyway, we got down to Florida, and she brought us over to these other men there, and she introduced us. And Cernan couldn't pick up his mother that day. He was busy, so Alan Bean picked her up from the airport. And he was accompanied by James Irwin, Charles Duke, and Bruce McCandless.
Oh my gosh.
So within 20 minutes of landing in Florida, we met three people who would eventually walk on the moon.
Oh, wow. Such a cool story. Yeah, it must have just been so surreal for you, at 19 to I love how you're just like, you guys wanted to go down there and see the launch for Apollo 11, and then you're like, "Well, I'm going to get press credentials. Let's do it." And then you made it happen, man. It's awesome.
Well, I got a number of life lessons from going down there, and one of them is aim high, you know,
Yeah.
and the second one is never give up,
Hmm.
uh, because at one point it looked pretty bleak that we would not get press credentials, and we would just be one of the over 1 million people that showed up there to see the launch,
Oh, wow.
and instead we were among 3,500 journalists from around the world who were there. And we had incredible access because of the press credentials, though.
Yeah. So what kind of stuff were you uh able to access? What kind of places, what kind of people were you able to meet and see?
Well, in terms of the places, we took two very long press tours. These were like small scale press tours. One of them, there was just like 9 journalists and a NASA contractor. And so, to give an example, we were able to go in the vehicle assembly building, and we got within 100 feet or so of the base of the Apollo 12 Saturn V, the one that was going to go up for the next flight. And we
Yeah.
were able to get right up at the base of it. The other thing is we were able to go up to all the way to the top of the VAB and look down and see the Apollo 11 command module sitting on top of the stack. We were right there with it.
Uh-huh.
And then at the Launch Control Center, we were able to actually get onto the floor of one of the firing rooms. There were 3 firing rooms that were active. We couldn't get on the floor of the Apollo 11 one, but we got on the floor of the other one, and we're actually able to like sit at the flight director's console
Oh my gosh.
with all the electronics and everything.
Yeah.
Uh, as far as the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket, we were able to get as close as 2,000 feet from it. Uh,
Hmm.
and at night, they took us out there, and there were these high intensity xenon lights that bathed the rocket. And it was the most incredible sight. I described it in my little diary as a jewel in the night. Uh,
Hmm.
these huge shafts of light on either side of it. So that was some of the physical things. And then we were at two large NASA press conferences and had a special interview. The press conferences, one of them was called the Center Director's Briefing. And I was in the same room there, just a few feet away from Werner von Braun, from Kurt Debus, the director of Kennedy Space Center, from Robert Gilruth, the head of the Manned Spacecraft Center, and from Dr. George Miller, the head of manned spaceflight then. Later on, and my friend had a personal 20-minute interview with George Miller about the future of spaceflight, one on
Wow.
one on one in his Holiday Inn motel room, along with a NASA public affairs officer. Uh,
Wow.
I later wrote an article about it. The other cool briefing we went to was the pre-launch briefing, and there were most of the key officials of the Apollo project. George Low was there, the head of the spacecraft program. Um, Deke Slayton was there, the head of the astronaut office. Charles Berry, the head of medical affairs, and there were just a whole bunch of people there giving a briefing on readiness before Apollo 11.
Yeah. So is this when you're this kind of stuff? Is it more like you're there just kind of sitting in on it so you can watch and see what's going on, or is it kind of an interactive Q&A type stuff with the press and people there?
Well, because of so much press, we didn't get to ask any questions, but we could have.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked to personally some of the people involved as well. So, for example, on the morning of the launch, we ran into astronaut Fred Hayes, who was the backup lunar module pilot and had been up all night flipping the switches in the Apollo 11 spacecraft, getting it ready to go. And we had a chance to talk to him in the morning just after the launch.
Oh, okay. Man, so fun. And you had already, I mean, this was such a huge treat for you because you already knew basically all these people and all this stuff going into it, right?
Right, yeah, I had been well versed in the space program. The first book I ever owned at age 8 was called Space Pilots by Willy Ley, and a German rocket scientist. And this was about the future selection and travel of astronauts into space.
Mm-hmm. Man, that's so cool. So, just jumping back real quick, what was the, you said you could go within 2,000 feet of the actual Apollo 11 rocket, correct?
Yes.
Or you had to say 2,000 feet away. Is that okay?
Wait, can we break for a second? I got to get rid of this phone. Hold on.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Is he on this phone? I apologize for that.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I'll just edit that stuff out. So, no
Okay,
biggie.
wait, let me get my soup first before you say.
So I'll just jump back into the question and then I'll just kind of splice it back. Cool.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. So just jumping back, you said that you could stay, or you couldn't go within 2,000 feet of the actual Apollo 11 rocket, correct?
Correct.
Was that for security reasons, or was it just because there was so much maintenance and work being done on it at the time that they didn't want you to get in the way?
Well, if you look at a Saturn V rocket, what it really is a controlled bomb. Okay, it's loaded with over 700 gallons, 700,000 gallons of kerosene.
Oh my gosh!
It's loaded with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. In fact, it's funny because there was a big round tank not too far from the pad for the liquid hydrogen, and it had a sign on it that said liquid hydrogen, no smoking. So there were all kinds of rocket propellants. There were hypergolic fuels. So it was a kind of dangerous place. We watched the rocket from the actual launch from 3.5 miles away. Mm-hmm. And that was where the VAB was, where the Launch Control Center was. And you might say, why 3.5 miles away? Yeah. Well, if the rocket exploded, that was the closest that you could be without being killed.
Oh my gosh. That's comforting. That's still...
Yeah. So for us to get within 2,000 feet of the rocket was pretty damn close.
Yeah. Man. And then so at night with these, these big lights on it, was there a purpose for those lights, or was it just to make it look cool?
I think it was to, just provide good visualization in case there was any problems with, a leak, say in rocket propellant, or any security issues or stuff like that.
Right.
Was the main reason, but it was just an absolutely magnificent sight.
Yeah.
The photos I took don't do it justice because it was very hard with a manual camera. The camera I brought with was a 1940s Kodak Retina camera that belonged to my dad.
Uh-huh.
This was before the days of modern cameras. Okay, it was totally manual. You had to set the f-stop and the speed, and I used color slide film, which didn't get developed for 2 weeks. So I had no idea if any of the pictures I took out actually came out.
Oh my gosh. That anticipation is something that am not used to today with our digital stuff, but I can imagine that was tense.
Well, looking back, what's remarkable to me is that we got to the moon with the technology that we had then. You know,
Yeah.
50 years ago, the only computers were mainframe computers, which would take up a whole room.
Mm.
Okay. The Apollo guidance computer, the DISCI, had less capability than any cell phone today. Uh, there was no internet. There were no social media. The way we phoned in our stories, I wrote in my manuscript that I phoned in the stories, and my editor, who's like in her 40s, said, "What did I mean by that?"
Uh-huh.
You know, we didn't have any access to teletypes. There were no computers or internet. So I actually had to get on a rotary telephone and dial up a rotary telephone, call the newspaper office, and then literally read word by word the text to someone else at the other end who was sitting at a typewriter and was typing it.
Oh man, but it works, right?
It worked. And I think that another example of the technology, you know, there were like thousands of sensors on the Saturn V rocket.
Hmm.
Each one of those had to be hardwired to the Launch Control Center because they had no other way of doing it.
Oh my gosh. So were there just like miles of wiring? Was that stuff visible?
No, it wasn't visible because it was well protected, but no, there was miles and miles of wiring.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's just so fun when you really dig into it and think of like the stuff they had to do. It's crazy.
It's really incredible that they were able to bring this off. And what's even more incredible is they did this in 8.5 years. President
Yes.
Kennedy proposed going to the moon on May 25th, 1961. Okay,
Hmm.
and there the only experience the U.S. had in space then was 15 minutes of suborbital flight by Alan Shepard.
Right.
There had never been a space rendezvous. There had never been a space docking. The thought that you could rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit was considered crazy then.
Hmm. So do you remember when President Kennedy kind of made that announcement that they wanted to get in space by the end of the decade?
Yeah, I do. I was 10 years old then, and I wasn't old enough to understand all the implications, but I understood, you know, what he was talking about. Plus, I had been a big fan of science fiction ever since I was very young. And there was, for example, a group of novels written by the late science fiction writer Robert Heinlein. These were so-called juvenile novels, and they talked about, you know, living on the moon, having jails on the moon, having revolts of the lunar inhabitants, you know, against the Earth. You know,
Yeah.
so all this was a part of science fiction, and Kennedy proposed to make it science fact.
Right. So, I mean, you were only 10 at the time, but do you remember if people felt it was doable, or did they feel like it was always going to be science fiction?
I think that the average person, I don't think really understood the enormity of the task.
Hmm.
Some of the people involved, like I had mentioned, Robert Gilruth was head of the Manned Spacecraft Center. He really thought that this was really, really difficult to do, uh,
Yeah.
and and he wasn't, you know, he wasn't sure that it was even doable at the time.
Right. Man.
But that decision's interesting because there have been declassified documents that produced a memo that President Kennedy sent to Vice President Johnson after Yuri Gagarin's flight and after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failed attempt by the United States to get rid of Castro.
Hmm.
But Kennedy wrote him a very specific memo saying, what single project can we do in space that we can beat the Russians with?
Yep.
And so it was definitely a product of the Cold War.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's just so crazy to me to think back that this was almost all fueled by kind of a competition to beat the Russians.
Right. There's absolutely no question about that with the documentation. Uh, and at that point, the United States even had no idea how they were going to get to the moon. There were three competing concepts to get to the moon, and each of them had proponents. And it wasn't until on my 12th birthday, on July 11th, 1962, it was announced the method that the U.S. would go to the moon, the so-called lunar orbit rendezvous method of going to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And that in and of itself is a fascinating story, how an engineer, John Hobolt, and a group of engineers at Langley prevailed over the proposals of Wernher von Braun and the Marshall Space Flight people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that, just reading up it, you just kind of take it for granted that, well, yeah, there's a lunar module, there's the service module. Of course, this is how it works, but there must have been an endless amount of ideas of how to possibly piece everything together and get to the moon.
Right. The most difficult thing about lunar orbit rendezvous was that the people were going to rendezvous and dock, 250,000 miles away from the Earth.
Yeah.
When the time they suggested that, there had never even been any Earth orbit rendezvous at all, even in Earth orbit, let alone at the moon. So
Yeah.
it was kind of an audacious plan, but all the engineering arguments were in favor of lunar orbit rendezvous.
Mm-hmm. Man, so cool. Okay, so let's jump ahead. I want to get to like kind of the what's going on maybe on the day of the launch that you're there. So like you're there in the morning and you get to see the astronauts walk out, correct?
Right. We set the alarm for 4:30 in the morning on July 16th, 1969. We were staying at the Sea Missile Hotel Motel, which
Mm-hmm.
was kind of an old, somewhat seedy place, but but it was kind of a low. We were on a low budget operation. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
So we couldn't stay at the Cape Kennedy Hilton or any of the nice hotels. So we stayed at kind of this dive. The only advantage was that it did have a swimming pool. Uh,
Nice.
and it advertised in the front on the sign. It said TV in every room air conditioned. Uh,
Dream come true. That's all you
right,
need.
especially for Florida in July. Uh,
Yeah, that's a good point.
so we had we had signed up and been able to get a be one of the few reporters out of the 3,500 who were to go and see the astronauts come out in their spacesuits, the so-called walkout of the astronauts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they had spent the last few days in what was called then the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, or MSOB was the NASA abbreviation for it. Today it's called the Armstrong O&C, Operations and Checkout Building. The same building is still there.
Hmm.
Uh, so they had their crew quarters there, and then early in the morning, they had a breakfast with some other astronauts, including Deke Slayton, and then they were suited up in their white spacesuits. And among the people suiting him up was Joe Schmidt, who just recently passed away at 103, I believe, uh,
Wow.
who was the guy who suited up Alan Shepard for America's first manned space flight. So he was there. And then there was a young guy there who was 23 at the time named Ron Woods.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Woods went on to be with NASA for decades later and became a space artist. And actually, I'm a friend and customer of his space art.
Oh,
He,
nice.
he specializes in doing pictures of spacesuits, which is not surprising.
Yeah.
Uh, anyway, so we got there on this bus. There were like three or four buses there. The buses let us off, and there's a roped out area in front of us. So as we get out the buses, all the reporters run like a rugby scrum with their elbows flying to get a space behind the ropes, because
Yeah.
otherwise you would be at the back. And so we were kind of penned in there behind the ropes. Deke Slayton came out first and did a television interview. And then around 6:30 a.m. in the morning, down the distance in the end of the corridor, we see a white dot.
Oh
And
my
as the
gosh.
white dot approaches, we see that it's Neil Armstrong leading the three astronauts. So it was Armstrong first, and then Mike Collins, and finally Buzz Aldrin. And they were followed by Joe Schmidt and Ron Woods, the spacesuit techs, and Deke Slayton and a couple of firemen.
Mm-hmm.
So Meanwhile, all the reporters and photographers were going crazy as they walked down with their elbows flying, trying to get pictures of the astronauts. And again, this was before digital cameras. We had no idea whatsoever if any of the pictures turned out.
Yeah.
Uh, but in my book, though, I show some of the pictures that I was able to take that morning. And in some ways, that was one of the emotional high points of the trip for me, because we saw the last few steps on Earth of the first men going to land on the moon.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so cool to see the photos that you actually took. You were actually there. It's awesome. And some of them aren't perfect. I think one, the exposure was off or something, so you had to convert it to black and white and stuff like that. But you were there. You took the photos.
Right. And that was, one of my other life lessons is be prepared. And the friend of mine who came, brought a Brownie Instamatic camera, and the pictures he got were really second or third rate. I think these pictures stand up pretty good 50 years later. I had the slides scanned professionally at a photo lab about 6 or 7 years ago
Hmm.
to digitalize them. And again, in the book, I think that's one of the really strong points of the book is these original photographs. Everybody has had views of Apollo 11, but mine are different than kind of the standard NASA pictures.
Yeah, that's true. It is a different feeling that your photos have, which I enjoy. So what was I mean, as the astronauts are walking out, what was their kind of demeanor? How did they kind of present themselves? Was it kind of a proud, excited kind of thing? Was it nervousness? How did you get a sense for that?
No, it was joy. It was excitement and joy. They gave thumbs up signs. They smiled. Uh, I missed the classic picture of Neil Armstrong giving a thumbs up sign because some other photographer stuck his head in the way
Oh, okay.
of that shot. But I did get Buzz and Mike Collins on that shot. But no,
Yeah.
they were very happy. It only lasted like a couple of minutes. It was very, very brief. But again, I think for everybody there, it was a very special moment.
Yeah. Man, it's so cool. And what was the vibe of the crowd? Was everybody kind of cheering and stuff, or what were they doing?
Well, they were cheering and they were madly taking pictures
Yeah.
as quickly as they could because it
I
was
could.
very, very brief. And kind of elbows were flying to position, and it was kind of a contact sport.
Yeah. So okay, so after so where do the astronauts go on that walkout? Are they loaded into a vehicle to transport them?
Yeah, they got into a NASA mobile van that took them to Pad 39A, where they went aboard their spacecraft.
Hmm.
Uh, so then my friend and I, we went on a NASA bus and headed back to the press site. The problem was that even within Kennedy Space Center, there was a massive traffic jam that day. And there was an even bigger traffic jam outside Kennedy Space Center as a million people were trying to find their best viewing possibilities. So we went to the Pad 39 press site, which is adjacent to the Launch Control Center, and got out there. But then we saw that there was a NASA bus going to what was called the VIP site.
Ooh.
And so we jumped on that. Uh, and And NASA had invited several thousand people to the launch,
Hmm.
and it included a wide range of people. There were politicians like President Johnson was there with Lady Bird. Um, William Westmoreland, the Army Chief of Staff and former Vietnam commander, was there.
Uh-huh.
There were a bunch of senators there. There were entertainers like Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon. The TV entertainers were there. There were
Oh,
there were actors there. Hugh O'Brien was there, and so NASA invited all these people there. And so we decided that we would kind of people watch while waiting for the rocket to go off, and it was fascinating.
all those folks kind of went to the VIP area, which you guys were managed to get to also.
Right, we kind of snuck in there.
Nice. Oh, that's so cool. That's like an extra little, fun, I don't know, side thing that all these, huge people are there to watch us, and of course they would be, but you got to kind of rub elbows with them a bit, huh?
Right, exactly. And again, there's some interesting pictures in the book that show some of these people. It was very difficult with the book to reduce the number of pictures. My publisher, Lid Publishing, was very generous, and there's 65 illustrations in the book, which is a lot. But I could have had 85 illustrations in the book, but I could have had actually 180
Oh my gosh.
illustrations. So a lot. We had to eliminate a lot of photos, and it was very, very hard. It's like, which of your children do you like the best?
Yeah, really. Man, okay, so this is where you're now 3.5 miles away from the launch, correct?
Right.
Okay, so
So
then go ahead, go ahead.
no, it's a warm Florida morning. It's a little bit humid, but not oppressive because it's very early. Now, months before, the launch date had been set at 9:32 a.m. on July 16th. Okay. Now, if you look at the history of manned spaceflight, it's extremely rare for launches to occur when they're actually scheduled because there's scrubs and there's postponements.
Hmm.
I had the ability only to take a week off of my summer job. And
Oh.
so we knew that if there was more than one postponement, it's likely that we missed the launch.
Hmm.
And so I was very nervous that morning. Would the launch actually go off on time? Uh, Again, because of this history of almost every launch of having problems, mechanical problems, weather problems, things like that. So we're standing there very nervous, watching. And again, we understood that we were 3.5 miles from this huge bomb
Yeah.
uh, that could explode. But the countdown was what NASA calls nominal, which is a kind of funny name for normal. It was a nominal countdown, and it went down, and there were no holds or postponements or anything like that.
Wow.
So I can describe the launch itself if you want.
Yes, please take me there.
Okay, so we're standing there. It's a blue sky, partially cloudy. Parenthetically, the launch that's shown in the movie First Man, which came out recently,
Hmm.
has got it all wrong. For, I guess, dramatic reasons, they launched into a cloudy sky, which just was not the case.
Oh.
And so at ignition, we see at the base of the rocket, and even though it was 3.5 miles away, I mean, this thing was 363 feet high, so you could see it very clearly. There was a
Hmm.
little tiny ball of fire at the base of the rocket. And then flames shoot out from either side because there's deflectors on either side. And does the rocket do anything? No, it just sits there for several seconds.
Huh.
And one of the surprises to me was how slowly the rocket launched off the pad, much slower than, say, a space shuttle launch. So it just kind of sits there. The flames are pouring out there, and we can't hear anything yet because light travels faster than sound.
Right.
So it starts to very, very slowly rise off the pad. And apparently it took up about 10 seconds for it actually to clear the tower. Uh,
Wow.
and so, I was kind of wondering, is there a problem with this? Why is it moving so slowly? Uh,
Uh-huh.
but that was normal. And then as it clears the tower, the sound hits us. Now, the sound of a Saturn V was the most overwhelming sound that I've ever experienced. Okay. You heard the sound, it was extremely loud. You felt the sound. The sound was attacking your chest. You could physically feel the sound. You could feel the vibration from it. And
Yeah.
as it lifted up, you could also feel the heat from it. There were 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And I mean, it wasn't like a burning heat, but you could sense the heat coming from this thing as it rose up.
Oh my gosh. That's incredible. 3.5 miles away, you could feel the heat.
Yes.
Incredible. So was there a countdown before launch that you guys heard like there is in the movies, or did that not happen?
No, it does happen. There was a public speaker, Squawk Box, that transmitted the countdown clock and transmissions. And the voice of launch control was a wonderful guy named Jack King, who had a very distinctive voice, was very, very professional, and really knew his stuff. And it was a pleasure to hear him do the countdown. And I was really great to meet him in later years, just a few years before he passed away.
Oh, cool.
But Jack King was the kind of voice of launch control at the time, and also did the moderated the news conferences that I mentioned.
Oh, okay. Okay, so man, so this is taking off. Is everybody there just kind of silently watching this? Are they cheering? What's going on?
No, they're cheering. They're cheering so loudly that despite the noise of the rocket, you can hear the cheering.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
and it was amazing. The rocket cleared the tower and then very gradually increased the speed as it got higher up.
Uh-huh.
And then after a couple of minutes, all you could see was a point of light in the sky. And then the sound started to go down, and then you could hear even better the cheering from the crowd.
Wow. So how long were you there from when it first started launching till, it basically disappeared and people started dispersing?
Well, the rocket was again like just a pinpoint in the sky after what I believe is probably maybe 3 minutes or so. So I mean, it didn't last a long time,
Mm-hmm.
but the cheering went on for a while, and then we kind of hung around to to get quotes from people, to talk to people. We talked briefly to Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon, the TV performers. Like I said before, we talked to Fred Hayes. We ran
Yeah.
into Gene Cernan, Tom Stafford, Bill Anders were at the VIP site there.
Oh, awesome. And you're with the press, you have a perfect excuse to come up to them and ask them a few questions.
Right. Well, I mean, I was an actual journalist then. I mean, this was not a sham or anything like
Right,
that.
yeah. Yeah.
I sent stories to the College Press Service and the Michigan Daily before the mission and after the mission. And So after these events, I would go back to the NASA News Center in Cape Canaveral. They rented an industrial building for the event because their normal facilities couldn't handle 3,500 journalists. So they rented this two-story structure there. And on the first floor, there was like a stage for press events and things like that, news conferences. That's where we saw Warder von Braun and the other center directors. And then on the second floor were contractor tables where all the different companies that were helping Apollo laid out all kinds of like press releases and stuff like that. And then NASA had an abundance of material. I only brought a half a suitcase on purpose,
Yeah.
and I loaded it up. So some of the items that they had available were you could get a copy of the actual press. I'm sorry, of the actual flight plan. You could get the press release. You could get lunar surface operations. And then also NASA stenographers recorded voice transcripts of everything that was said from the air to ground communication over the course of the mission. So
Mm-hmm.
I have like an 8-inch stack of original voice transcripts from 1969 that I shoehorned into my suitcase.
Oh my gosh. What a treat. So you got to take this stuff was all there just for you to take, and do you still have it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, the most precious thing I have is that one of the things that they had were lunar orbit charts. So these were very long, in color maps of the traverse of the Apollo 11 across the moon. And these lunar orbit charts, years later, 24 years later, I decided to try and get an autograph by Neil Armstrong. Uh, and he very rarely autographed stuff then.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sent it to him in Ohio. I had an address there, and it got sent back marked refused.
Oh
Uh,
my gosh.
and so, never giving up, I decided to try and send it to him care of the astronaut office in Houston. They
Uh-huh.
don't do this anymore, but then they would forward mail. So months went by, and I didn't have anything back, and I thought I had lost this map.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then on the 25th anniversary of the landing, on July 20th, 1994, I go out to my mailbox, and there's a brown paper envelope, and it has a Cincinnati return address. And my hands were literally shaking as I opened this. And it was this lunar orbit chart signed by Neil Armstrong to me. Best wishes to Dr. Dave Chudwin, Neil Armstrong. And I found out that he had stopped autographing July 20th, 1994, the 20th anniversary, 25th anniversary. And this was probably one of the last things that he had signed.
Wow. That is so cool. Yeah, because it's kind of you mentioned this in your book. It's kind of an interesting thing where, some astronauts would be willing to sign everything. Some would charge, for their signatures. And now some of them have, like the Neil Armstrong signature is pretty valuable, isn't it even?
Yes. Um, Probably the least expensive Neil Armstrong signature would be about $700 to $800. But it's interesting because he said that he had signed, until he stopped signing in 1994, close to 100,000 autographs uh,
Wow.
through the years because he would get, huge numbers of requests.
Yeah.
uh, and that. So some people, he was happy to pose for a picture, happy to have handshakes with people. But after that time, he almost never autographed anything.
Interesting. Yeah, I could imagine how you would just get kind of fed up with that or annoyed a bit, but it's understandable. Wow. So okay, so then so this launch happens. After the launch, you're kind of collecting all this materials, you're writing stuff, sending it back, and then do you stay there for a few days until they touch down on the moon, correct?
Yes, that's correct. My friend decided that he wanted to see the moon landing, back at home, but I wanted to be there. Now, most of the press flew off to Houston to be at mission control for the landing. Again,
Oh,
I was a very low budget operation, and
yeah.
I didn't have the money to fly to Houston, so I decided to stay there. So instead of having 3,500 journalists there, there were maybe 300 journalists left.
Huh.
Um, Either they were foreigners or other people like myself who were too poor to fly to Houston.
So was that kind of an advantage then to have less people there?
Well, it was a little bit lonely. I mean, it lacked some of the excitement, but for the landing itself, I watched it from the launch control center, the second floor there, where they had these long press tables, and they had the loudspeakers with all the voice commentary, and they had a couple of color television sets, to see the networks.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it was not anywhere near as crowded as before. But it
Right.
was every bit as exciting.
Man. So during that time was there a feeling of, tenseness, nervousness, or was it excitement still?
No, it was nervousness.
Okay.
I think the more people knew about the landing, the more worried they were about success.
Yeah.
Everything had to go perfectly uh, because the landing was risky. One of the main problems was that the maps and imaging that they had was pretty good, but it didn't show enough resolution to pick out boulders or things like that. So Neil Armstrong's original landing site was loaded with large boulders, which could have destroyed the lunar module. Uh, and
Mm-hmm.
um, and so he decided to fly beyond that. But beyond that was a small crater in which they could not land either because the lunar module would likely tip over. Uh,
Yeah.
and so he had to keep flying. And it was very nerve-wracking, and we didn't realize how nerve-wracking it actually was because as he flew over the small crater, the Capcom Charlie Duke uh, called out to him 30 seconds. What that meant was you damn well better find a landing site within 30 seconds or you're going to run out of fuel and crash.
Yeah.
And that. And Charlie Duke, who was kind enough actually to write a advanced praise for my book, but Charlie Duke, famously said when they landed, Roger, Tranquility Base, and instead of Tranquility, he was so excited he said Twank, and then had to correct himself. You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thank you.
Yeah.
And again, that was the concern about landing before they ran out of fuel. But that was one of the reasons they chose Neil Armstrong to command this mission, is that he had a record of being really cool under pressure. And two examples of that were the Gemini 8 flight, where they went into a rapid rotation, so much that him and Dave Scott almost passed out. Their vision,
Wow.
their vision was starting to narrow, and they started to pass out. He was able to figure out that it was a thruster problem and disengage and save them from what would have been a fatal result in a few seconds later. Um,
Ooh.
the other time that he showed that he had the right stuff was he was testing the Lunar LLRV, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, which was a way of testing the lunar landing. The other kind of nickname for it was the flying bed, uh, which had rockets and everything. Anyway, it was about to crash, and just before the last second, he ejected from it and saved himself. And otherwise,
Wow.
he'd been killed by a crash of the LLRV. So he was known for being a real cool customer under pressure, and one of the ultimate test pilots.
Yeah. He had proven himself, huh?
Right.
Whew. Okay, man, this is so fun to hear this story from you. So after the moon landing, how long do you then stay in Florida?
Well, I left the next day because I had to get back to my easy job selling fancy men's clothing on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like the summer job of a lifetime. Uh, and it's interesting. I could only get 1 week off of work that summer. So I had another opportunity. There was going to be the next month in August a music festival in New York called Woodstock.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to make a choice between Woodstock or Apollo.
Oh. So I think you made the right choice. What do you think?
I think I did too. There were, even though Woodstock was unusual, there have been other music festivals since then, but not a first landing on the moon.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Very true. But then later, they came back in the you got to see them again in the parade in Chicago, right?
Yeah, they were in isolation to protect us against moon organisms, which were, I mean, it sounds kind of outlandish right now and ridiculous, but at the time, out of extra caution, the astronauts were kept in isolation and they were released to their families. And then on August 13th, 1969, uh, President Nixon orchestrated these appearances for him where they had a ticker tape parade in New York in the morning. They came to Chicago and had a parade in the afternoon. And then at night, they went to Los Angeles where Nixon met them and they were given the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Oh, wow.
I
I didn't
think,
realize it was all one day.
yeah, it was all one day. And then later, he sent them on this worldwide tour, all over the world. But in Chicago, I decided that I wanted to see them again after them returning from the moon. So I pulled out my NASA press pass, even though it wasn't supposed to be used for Chicago. But I pulled out my NASA press pass and I got my Kodak Retina camera, and so I followed them along the first part of the parade and was able to see them go up Michigan Avenue and up State Street. And by that time, I got kicked out by the police, and and so I missed them going up LaSalle Street, which was the bulk of the tape. I'm sorry, the ticker tape parade.
Hmm.
But I saw them at close range and got some good photographs again, which are featured in the book.
Yeah. So what was the feeling and vibe of that parade and the crowd?
Oh, it was absolute joy and exhilaration.
Yeah.
They had accomplished the impossible, and people realized, how brave they were, that they took considerable risk, and that they made it work. The estimates before the flight were that they only had a 50% chance of actually landing on the moon and coming back the first try. Uh,
Wow.
and Armstrong accepted that estimate. Um, there was probably about a 10% chance of them losing their lives, uh,
Hmm.
was the figures at the time. So, people really appreciated this, and it was a tremendous accomplishment for the United States at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been different from them initially walking out that morning of the launch to being completely done and have completed everything. They're home safe and they accomplished their mission of landing on the moon. And now it's time to kind of celebrate all the hard work that's been done for the past decade.
Well, the astronauts were very clear that they were kind of at the top of a pyramid, that there were actually over 400,000 American workers, technicians, administrators of different types that had actually worked on the Apollo program.
Hmm.
And they were kind of like representatives of that. I mean, they did the flying and everything, but they were not the ones that did the engineering plans, that built the capsules, that built the rockets, and that.
Yeah, that's good to hear that they were kind of communicating that whole uh, that there were so many people that really made this possible.
One of the things you might notice is if you look at the mission patch for Apollo 11, the
Uh-huh.
astronauts would not let their names be put on it. Most of the other mission patches have the names of the astronauts, but there's no astronaut names on the Apollo 11 patch. And
Huh.
that was symbolic to them that, that it wasn't just them who were flying, that it was the entire country.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I like that. Very cool. Whew, I love this. Okay, so I know you're like a huge, you've always been interested in space and you talk about this in your book. So I kind of want to get into kind of, where we're at today with our space objectives and stuff like that. So what do you kind of
Sure.
make of the current, space, moon, Mars environment?
Okay, well, one of the chapters I title "No Bucks, No Buck Rogers." In other words, if you don't get the money, you're not going to fly. And with all the other budget pressures, the NASA budget now is half of what it was during the Apollo program.
Hmm.
If you took a look at what the highest budget point for NASA was in 1966, when they were getting ready all the facilities and rockets and stuff like that. If you took the current dollar amounts of that, the NASA budget would be $44 billion now, and it's only 20 billion. So we're operating in space on less than half of the equivalent of what we were, 50 years ago,
Hmm.
because there are a lot of other demands on the budget. What's really turning the tide and making the big difference is two things. First of all, is international cooperation. The space station, International Space Station, has important contributions from many other countries, from Russia, from Japan, from Canada, from the European Space Agency, and they've contributed to the cost of the International Space Station. It would not have been possible on a budget with just the U.S. And in
Hmm.
fact, President Reagan proposed that as an earlier version called Space Station Freedom, but there wasn't enough money to do it. And when it became clear that it wasn't feasible, then the scope of it was downsized a little bit, but then these other countries were brought in. Uh, so, for example, the NASA has a plan to put a space station around the moon called Lunar Orbital Gateway.
Hmm.
And this Gateway project is also going to be international as well, with different countries providing different modules. So by cost sharing, that makes it more feasible. But the most exciting development has been commercial space, uh,
Hmm.
what my friend Rod Pyle calls Space 2.0. And this is the rise of commercial companies, largely fueled by internet billionaires. So, for example, Elon Musk's SpaceX, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, the late Paul Allen's uh, cooperation with Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic.
Hmm.
And these people are spending a lot of their own money on space, augmenting what we can do beyond just the NASA budget, which is stuck around $20 billion a year. Uh, for example, very quietly, Jeff Bezos's company, Blue Origin, is planning the first space tourist flights in competition with Virgin Galactic. But they have
Hmm.
a spacecraft called New Shepard. And within the next year or two, they're going to be sending people into space. Now, it's only going to be a 6 minute of weightlessness and 15-minute suborbital flight, but it's still taking people into space. And uh, Bezos with New Shepard, it's been estimated that he's spending $1 billion a year. That's billion with a B of his own money on Blue Origin. Uh, if,
Wow.
if you go down to the Cape, like I was a couple weeks ago, Just outside the Kennedy Space Center, Blue Origin has this huge, huge new factory that they've built there that you drive by on the way to the Cape Kennedy Visitor Center.
Uh-huh.
And so I really think that what's going to be needed is a combination of NASA, international cooperation, and these commercial companies to get things going.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel kind of optimistic about all those coming together?
Yes, I actually do. I mean, for a while, I was very pessimistic. I mean, 50 years ago, when I was at Apollo 11, the thought that 50 years later, the US would need to rely on the Russians to take our astronauts into orbit. I mean, I would have been labeled absolutely insane
Yeah,
at the time. Nobody ever would have expected that. Uh,
right.
and in 1969, they thought that Americans could get to the moon, get to Mars in the late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are all these kind of unrealistic plans. But I think that the current situation is the best that I've seen it in years. And there are going to be hiccups along the way, like the Crew Dragon blowing up, that SpaceX just had. There
Mm-hmm.
are hiccups there. There are going to be other problems too. But the long-term outlook, I think, is very optimistic.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is inevitable. But do you, I feel like there's a lot more kind of excitement in space kind of being built up, especially with, this may be my biases and of what I see on social media and everything with, at least Elon Musk and SpaceX and everything being done. It feels like people are talking about it more and there's a lot of excitement. Do you think it's possible to get back to that 1960s feeling of, going to the moon, or now we're going to Mars, hopefully, or back to the moon, without that kind of competition, of beating the Russians?
Well, what about beating the Chinese? Because I think that there's a real concern about China in the long run. And this is a very controversial subject, but the Chinese space program is dominated by the Chinese military. Uh, China is does not have a political democracy, so they can set a long-term goal and then follow through with it because the same people are going to be in charge for years and years and years. It's not a new 4-year election cycle.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I think that, there's the tortoise and the hare that the Chinese may have started behind, but they're very, very gradually getting better and better. We're still ahead of them in technology. But, if you look in the long-term future, 50 or 100 years, we may have foreign competition forcing us to take care of this.
Wow. So is China being kind of cooperative with us then, as far as like, uh, you know, space stations and stuff like that, or is it more a competitive vibe, do you feel?
Well, it's competitive, and part of that is the United States' fault because of concerns about Chinese stealing technology. They've forbidden, there's been a congressional resolutions and actual laws prohibiting NASA from cooperating with China on manned spaceflight.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So now we have the plan to go back to the moon, correct? That's a NASA objective now?
Yes.
So why is that?
Why go back to the moon?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's some people that say Mars first, that we should head out to Mars, okay? A round trip mission to Mars would take approximately 3 years with present technology.
Hmm.
There are some new propulsion proposals, for like ion thrusters and things like that might make it sooner. But basically, the current architecture is a 3-year mission. Okay, um, the moon you can get to in 3 days,
Yeah.
and in terms of safety, as far as radiation exposure, in terms of human factors, it's much easier to test everything in what's being described as cislunar space. Cislunar space is a space between the Earth and the Moon's orbit. And so that's why there's a plan to have this small man-tended space station called Gateway there within the next few years. So the moon is a lot more practical, and I'm certainly one of those who am a moon first person. I think eventually we should go to Mars, but I just don't think the technology is available now. And as a physician, I'm concerned about the human factor concerns as well. And if you look at some of the medical issues involved in long-term space flight, which a Mars mission would require, there's problems with the immune system, there's problems with bone density, there's problems with vision, and especially problems with radiation, with cosmic rays. The Van Allen belt protects us against a lot of the cosmic rays. But if you're out between the Earth and the Moon, you're going to need to really take that into account.
Right. So is the moon kind of a good test bed for all this for going to Mars?
In many ways, yes. Either the moon or in orbit around the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the architectures for going to Mars would be to assemble the rocket complex to go to Mars, to do that in lunar orbit at the gateway. And so use the gateway as a gateway. In other words, to send off things further out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you look at the physics of it, the Earth has a very deep gravity well, and it takes a lot of energy to get things up into Earth orbit. Once you're in Earth orbit, it takes much less energy to go to the moon or to go from the moon further on in space.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And then, so are we looking at colonizing the moon at all?
Well, especially the Europeans have been interested in that. The European Space Agency has had several international conferences about establishing a lunar base in the late 2020s and 2030s.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of interest in that. And, you know, at the press conference I went to with Wernher von Braun was asked, what's the significance of flying to the moon? And he compared it to when amphibians first left the oceans to go on land. At the time, I thought that was very much a hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
But through the years, the more I've thought about it, the more I realized that that's true. That you know, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian rocket pioneer, said the Earth is the cradle of civilization, but we don't stay in the cradle forever. You know, something to that effect. And so I think the colonization of the moon is going to be the first step of extending human presence throughout the solar system.
Mm-hmm.
There's planets, there's asteroids, there's comets, there's moons, and there's billions and billions of cubic kilometers of space within the solar system. So I really think that that's the future of humankind.
Wow. And so I've heard it being kind of equated to, backing up the human race, like putting us on a second hard drive so, we don't go extinct and stuff like that. Like that's kind of maybe a big benefit for colonizing Mars or something like that. Like what do you think about that?
No, I very much agree with that. You know, one of my favorite nonfiction space books from the early Apollo program was a book by the Italian journalist called Oriana Fallaci. And she wrote a fascinating book called If the Sun Dies. And that kind of encapsulates, taking a long-term perspective. If you look in the time perspective of billions of years, eventually the sun will die. You know, it'll gradually burn up its fuel and then expand and destroy the solar system. But that's on an order of billions of years. In the next hundreds of years, though, an asteroid strike, global warming leading to turning Earth into Venus, nuclear war, all these other possibilities could potentially destroy the human race. And so it's been suggested that space colonization is kind of a lifeboat for humanity. And one of the proponents of this before he passed away was the great physicist Stephen Hawking, suggested that we had better, get some of us off Earth to prevent the destruction of humankind.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious because your perspective, I guess we should mention that you didn't you're not a journalist for NASA anymore. You became a physician, correct?
Right, I'm an allergist immunologist.
Right. So I'm curious, do you feel that we can kind of overcome any obstacles in regards to radiation and bone density kind of stuff with living on the moon or in a space station or on Mars?
Well, the problem is not so much being on the moon and Mars in terms of because there's gravity there. And a lot of the ill health effects from being in space is microgravity. And so that, even though the gravity on the moon is only 1/6 of that on Earth, there's still enough that it helps with some of these problems. The biggest problem on the moon and Mars, actually on the surface, is like I said before, radiation. And there are strategies to mitigate that. Moon or Mars colonies would be made under the soil, the so-called regolith,
Hmm.
and that would give protection. In terms of flying to Mars, there have been suggestions that the fuel tanks, say water tanks and things like that, be placed around the inner core that had the people in it, so that these water tanks would protect them and shield them from radiation. So there are some
Interesting.
strategies for this, but we don't really have enough long-term information. Scott Kelly just did a magnificent mission, spending nearly a year in space with his brother Mark as the control on Earth. And
Hmm.
NASA has just proposed two additional long-term missions to in Earth orbit. And I think the more information we get on that, the better it'll be.
Okay. And so that was kind of to study the effects because he was in basically microgravity for that whole time, right?
Right, right.
Okay. And so that's kind of studying the effects of that. Is that um so that would be the concern if we're kind of living in space stations or something, correct?
Right, unless there was artificial gravity in the space stations, not in current ones, but in these, visionary plans for space stations. For example, that Werner von Braun had in the 1950s. They had this notion of these spinning round satellites in orbit, very
Yeah.
large ones, and the spinning would give artificial gravity. Uh, but again, this is far beyond our current designs.
Oh, okay. Would artificial gravity basically alleviate the issues?
Yes, it would greatly help them.
Okay.
It really would. Uh, there's all kinds of effects of microgravity on the human body. There's nothing is pulling the fluid or anything down to the legs, so all the fluid in the body kind of rises up, and this is why astronauts on orbit, have these real puffy faces because the fluid is all isn't pulled down by gravity like it should be.
Huh. Interesting how I mean we evolved to live on Earth, so those are the conditions we need to simulate.
Right. I mean, another issue is balance and vestibular. There's something called space adaptation syndrome, which some people get more than others. And Frank Borman on Apollo 8 had some of this with throwing up and nausea and vomiting, but they didn't even know what it was. And then one of the most celebrated episodes was Rusty Schweickart in Apollo 9 was unable to do a complete spacewalk because if you vomited inside a closed spacesuit, that was going to be a real problem. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a funny story. I was seated at the same table as Rusty Schweickart at a Space Fest banquet. We were eating lunch, and I made the mistake of asking him about space adaptation syndrome while he was eating. Uh, and he did not appreciate that at all.
This is something I was curious about because you seem so informed and up to date on everything going on currently with the space industry. What's your go-to, website or blog or news source or TV channel or anything for where you get all your information?
Well, I get it from multiple sources. Space.com is a very helpful online source. As far as space collecting and memorabilia, there's a wonderful website that Robert Perlman started in 1999 called collectspace.com
Okay.
and is excellent. And on Facebook, there's a wonderful group called Space Hipsters that has over 16,000 of the most interesting people I've ever met. I just was a speaker at their spring field trip and spoke last Saturday at the Neil Armstrong Air and Space Museum in Wapakoneta, Ohio.
Oh,
And we had about 50 people there from the group from all over the country. And so there's a wealth of information there. And besides them on Facebook, there's a whole bunch of other interest groups related to different aspects of space. So there's, a interest group related to SpaceX has one, and there's one to Apollo project history and a bunch of others. So there's a lot of online resources that we didn't have at all back, 50 years ago.
yeah. Yeah, it's cool how this information's so readily available. It's so fun to dig into it and read about the history, but then all the new stuff coming out too. I love it. Man, well, David, this was incredible. I love hearing your story. You're an awesome storyteller. It was so fun to hear all this stuff. So we got your book. I was a teenage space reporter right here. We both got it. I'll throw a link to this. It's on Amazon. Anywhere else we should send people?
Well, it's in brick and mortar Barnes and Noble stores in some cities. It's not across the country. So, for example, in the Chicago area here, it's available in most Barnes and Noble stores, and in some others. But the most assured way to get it is to get it online through a bookselling website. It's available at all the bookselling websites, and it just went on sale on Thursday in United Kingdom and other places around the world for online booksellers too.
Awesome. Well, congrats. It's an awesome book. It's, the photos are beautiful. It's well written. Very, very nice. I really enjoyed it.
Great. It's been fun talking, and it's again, it's hard to believe that it's 50 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, it's very cool that we have all this, the 50th anniversary coming up and all these events and stuff coming up to kind of re-spark it a bit. And it feels like it's a cool time when, if space is kind of taking off again and we're going places.
Well, just real quickly, I wrote the book for two audiences. One was for people my age, in their 60s and 70s, because it's kind of a nostalgia trip, bringing them back to what it was like 50 years ago. But I especially wrote it for the younger people, young adults, who weren't there for these events, but to try and give them a sense of the excitement and sense of wonder we had at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that I've been like really loving and feeling is that sense of excitement. I've been digging into a lot of stuff and talking with people like you who are there. So it's very fun to hear. So yeah, I mean, it was awesome. Thanks, David. Really appreciate you being on and sharing your
Thank you.
story.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course.